Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Sloan, for both organizing and funding this. I'm really delighted to be here. Before I start on the actual talk, this is work that's done with Mark Cullen. I have two quick caveats. The first is that this is very much preliminary work. So this is part of a larger project where we are trying to better understand both the drivers and also the consequences of work trajectories over long periods of American working life. And you've sort of caught us midstream in terms of our work. So this is sort of hopefully kind of an initial pass at the types of work we want to do, and then I'll spend some time towards the end talking about places that we plan to expand, and certainly would love to hear also ideas in the Q&A section about that. The second quick caveat I'll give is that I think Mark and I might be approaching this question slightly differently. I'm trained as a demographer, actually by Ron Lee, who's in the room. Mark comes from a health perspective, and so we very much have kind of a health slant on much of our work. So as such, I think some of the approaches and to some extent the analytics may be slightly different from what you're used to seeing, though I'd be very surprised if this were entirely new to anybody. I think there's some amount of familiarity, in the type of work we're doing. So the project here is to characterize work and disability in a working life, and we're using a multi-state approach. The main premise of our work is that as it relates to working longer, both in terms of the ability and the desire for individuals to do so, we believe that cumulative effects of the working life over the life course may be just as important as decisions that happen around retirement age. So trying to sort of pull back the curtain, if you will, on the age profile to think about what happens at 20, 30, 40, 50 years old in terms of work environments and the way that the work environments interact with health and job characteristics and family life and other things, to see how those cumulative effects lead to the kinds of disparities that we see in terms of people's both ability and desire to be able to work longer. For this particular project, we have 4 aims. The first is to calculate transition rates across various states of work and disability across a working life. The second is to try to characterize common trajectories between work and disability in a specific cohort of workers that I'll describe. The third then is to use these trajectories and see if we can identify socioeconomic, sociodemographic, and health characteristic differences across the individuals in these different trajectories. And then finally, I'm going to tease at this. This is sort of work we're doing next, but we have some preliminary findings that just sort of look at whether we see any associations between different work trajectories and retirement patterns, and specifically propensities towards early retirement. Not sure that I really need a lot of motivation for this room, but I'll give some anyhow. We know that transitions out of work and into both short and long-term disability have very important consequences, both sort of socially and economically, and also at individual levels. There are people in this room that have done work that show that while life expectancy is increasing, while people tend to be working longer, there are also increasing disability roles, that's happening at the federal level. And I think what is sort of more new to that is that it's also happening at all ages. So we've seen increases in disability roles in older ages, but also in people that are presumably in the prime of their working life. These transitions into short and long-term disability have a number of important individual level consequences as well. They've been associated with a loss of lifetime earnings, increased medical cost, and then non-financial impacts as well, so family disruption and psychosocial distress as well. So we know a lot about the causes of these transitions. What we tend to know less about are the sort of dynamics that happen within the working life that lead people both in and out of these kinds of transitions. And one of the reasons we don't know much about, is the same reason we never know much about anything, is that the data to bear on this are fairly limited. So to do something like this well, we really need extended cohorts where we are able to see at very minute levels of detail where they're working and when they're transitioning in and out of disability, which is not always an easy thing to do. So here I think we might be well placed to answer a question like this. I want to introduce the Alcoa dataset. This is a sort of academic industry collaboration that Mark started now more than 2 decades ago. The Alcoa dataset, for those of you who don't know, tracks workers that are at Alcoa. Alcoa is a large aluminum manufacturing firm. The sort of core of the data is what I'll be using today, and that consists of the human records claims, which I'll describe in some amount of detail in a bit, but as with all of these sorts of administrative data, it has sort of grown arms and legs over the years, and so we now have, either directly through Alcoa or through various data linkages, sort of an entire trove of other data that are linked to the Alcoa workers. So, for example, we know quite a bit about their health. We have medical claims files for them. Most of them are on the same insurance plan and have fairly good coverage, and so we know a bit about their hospitalizations, about the prescription drugs they use. We've also linked now to CMS data, and so we have their CMS claims as well. The sort of core of this relationship when it started very much in occupational health, and so we know a number of things about them in terms of job exposures as they relate to dust, noise, and heat. We have some information on psychosocial demand as well. And then we've linked in more recent years to housing data, some foreclosure data, and as I'll point to in a minute, the sort of next big data effort is to try to link to Social Security data as well. So for the sake of this project, I'll be focusing on the human resources data, so the HR data specifically. Just to sort of give a sense of the variation, there are a total of 32 plants in Alcoa that vary quite a bit by both size and geographic location. On this point, I think I'll also take a second to mention now, I was going to do so later in the talk, but to mention now that while we think of manufacturing as a fairly specific kind of industry, I will point out that in the Alcoa database, there is actually quite a large variation in terms of the kinds of jobs that are available. So certainly we have hourly versus salaried workers, but even within the salaried workers, there are fair shares of workers that work in smelters and hot pots and do really quite nasty work. But there are also a number of people that work in sort of more managerial roles, work as truckers, work as administrators or coordinators. And so there really is kind of a larger variation in terms of the kinds of job exposures than one might imagine when they first hear that one is studying manufacturing. So in terms of the data and the sample, we use here human records data that start in 1997, and we track them through the end of 2013. So the beauty of this data is that we know on every single day whether a worker has come to work or not. If they're working, we know how much they're making and what kind of job they're in. And importantly for this project, if they're not working, we know why they're not working. So we know whether or not they've gone on a short-term disability, whether they're on long-term disability, or whether they're on one of many types of leave of absences. And this is what we'll exploit. In doing so, we create 5 states. So the standard state is regular work. That means they've come to work and worked their shift and gone home. Short-term disability is the second. Long-term disability is the third. On leave essentially encompasses all kinds of other forms of leave that are not STD or LTD. And then the last category is termination. So termination is the term that we borrow from the Alcoa HR, but it refers to leaving Alcoa. So it's not only those that are fired, it's people who voluntarily left as well. The entire sample that we use for this is 26 plants. There are 42,000, just over 42,000 workers. We have information on them daily. We aggregate it up to monthly to sort of make some more sense of it. And so we end up with just over 2 million worker month observations. Because this is administrative data, we don't have perfect covariate data on all plants. Some plants are just better at keeping track of these than others. So for the covariates, we subsampled to 14 plants, and there the number of workers is just over 16,000. Just to give a sort of quick definition in terms of these different states. So both STD and LTD here are Alcoa-administered states. These are sort of codes that go into the HR code because the worker has applied to Alcoa STD or LTD. STD covers up to 6 months. LTD covers up to 5 years. And for LTD, one must describe that they are sort of prove that they are fully disabled and also that they've already applied for federal SDI. Leave includes, as I mentioned, sort of all other forms of leave. Importantly, FMLA we did categorize under leave. We wanted to really distinguish between what are sort of normal family occurrences that fall under STD and what are sort of maybe more job specific. And then for now, anybody who is not working, we've coded as terminate or leaving Alcoa. We would very much like to have distinguished in termination between those that are retiring. At this point, with the data we have two ways to do it. One is that some do self-report when they leave that they've retired. I've taken a close look at that data, and it's pretty spotty. Again, these things are very plant-specific, so I think until we do further work on that, we're not totally confident to use that alone. Most of these workers, or many of these workers, do have pensions, and so we are able to sort of exploit pension eligibility, so those who are fully or partially pension eligible who leave, we could categorize as retired. So these are things we're playing around with. Again, because of the administrative data is less than perfect, we're sort of careful before we retirement status, particularly provided that that's one of the outcomes we're looking at. Ideally, again, we're sort of in the process of trying to get SSA data. If that comes through in a reasonable amount of time, we're now 4 years in the making, then we can sort of attribute retirement more specifically using that data linkage. And then just to give a quick schematic, so you see that transitions are probable across any number in almost all of the states. Terminate here is an absorbing state, which means once somebody has left Alcoa, in our data, they cannot come back. That's not empirically true. There are people who do come back to Alcoa, but that is a relatively small percentage of people. Just in sort of brief overview in terms of the demographics, health, and other job conditions, we have self-reported health, ethnicity, age, and sex. We have marital status, and we have a measure of the number of dependents under the age of 6. For health characteristics, we have hospitalizations, both inpatient and outpatient, for asthma, depression, diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension. We also have a thing called a risk score. A risk score is something that was created that essentially uses the health claims data to track medical expenditure. So the risk score goes from 0 to about 6 and is standardized. And essentially, the lower the number, the lower your health expenditures, the higher the number, the worse your health expenditures. It's an imperfect measure for actual health. So there's been some work done in our group that have tracked expenditures to actual sort of physical health and shown that those two track very well together. But I do want to sort of caveat that it is, in its definition, it's an expenditure measure. And then, as I mentioned, we have job characteristics. So we know plant location, hourly salaried. We know their hourly wage and their W-2s. And then, as I mentioned, we have some data on exposure as well. There are some data limitations. We do not know what happens to people after they leave Alcoa, with the exception of when we capture them back in CMS data, and hopefully with SSA data eventually as well. We don't know much about their spouses other than the families in which there are 2 spouses working at Alcoa, and that does happen about 10% of the workers in Alcoa. We don't have total household income, of course. We just have the W-2s from Alcoa, and then we don't, at this point, have a direct measure of SDI claiming. So the empirical strategy, as I mentioned, we start by calculating the transition rates. We do so for monthly, yearly, and then for the total 17 period of time. These are just simple Markov chains, so we're just predicting state J at time t plus 1, conditional on state I at time t. We do so by stratify by sex and then also by age greater and less than 40 years old. The second empirical step is to use sequence and cluster analysis to build trajectories of work and disability, and I'll describe those in a minute. And then the third step, again, this is sort of where we're headed next, is to model early retirement as a function of these trajectories. Just to give a general sense of the cohort, it is manufacturing, so it is overwhelmingly male, and a bit higher percentages of whites as well. You'll see that Alcoans are paid pretty well, particularly given that many of these plants are in parts of the country in which the cost of living is relatively low. And they are, on average, a little sicker than the average population. So again, using this sort of risk score and the incidences of chronic disease, we see that they are generally tend to be a bit sicker than the total American population, though not wildly so. So I'll talk about the transition rates first. Instead of sort of showing you a bunch of matrices, I decided that it would be more interesting to pull out a few of the transitions by age schematically, just to sort of give a sense of what these look like. So this is a transition from regular work to disability, in this case, short-term disability. And this looks, at least in my mind, what one might imagine it would look like. So probabilities into disability go up with age. Now, do sort of keep track of the axis here. The probabilities are still relatively low. So by and large, people are going to work and stay in regular work for much of their time. And you'll see that more of that in a minute. This is the same thing now from regular work to long-term disability. And again, we see sort of what we might expect, so higher transition rates at older ages, lower transition rates at younger ages, and axis is very small here. So again, the transition into LTD is fairly rare. So this I wanted to highlight because I found it, at least in my mind, fairly counterintuitive. So these are people that are going from short-term disability back to regular work. And what we see is that the probabilities of going back to regular work are actually lower at younger ages than they are at older ages. We don't entirely know why that is yet. My suspicion is that this is selection out of these kinds of jobs. So that people at younger ages, sort of have some kind of STD episode and tell themselves, forget it, I'm out of here, I'm gonna go find a different job. The stable income and the pension and all of it doesn't seem as appealing as it had. And that sort of levels off at older ages. And then on the opposite end, so now these are transitions from long-term disability back to regular work, and we see sort of the reverse thing happening for most ages. What I wanted to point out here is just the uptick at older ages. I think this is a very good indication of pension and pension incentives. So for people that are over the age of 52, 53, who see that pension eligibility may be less, within 10 years away, I think a lot of people sort of stick out working jobs, either going back to the job they have or possibly transitioning jobs within Alcoa after an LTD event. So the second part of this is to characterize the trajectories of work and disability. And here we sort of have one essential question, which is what are the most common trajectories of work and disability? And then we want to see how the demographic health and job characteristics are associated with these. The methodology we use here is called sequence analysis. For those of you who are not familiar with this, the goal is essentially to create groupings of workers based on similar work disability and leave trajectories. Sequence analysis happens in 3 parts. So the first part is essentially to do a comparison. So, we literally have 42,000 sequences of people's states for every month that they're working between these 17 years. And then we create a distance measure that basically sees how similar or dissimilar these different sequences are. Then we use a grouping. So this is a cluster analysis. So then we just sort of use a grouping algorithm we use, for those familiar with it, in Elzinger's longest common sequence, but there's essentially a number of different ways that you can sort of group the different trajectories based on their distances. And then finally, what you end up with is essentially just a variable that one can use either on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of an equation, thinking about it in a very standard frameworks like regressions and survival analysis and that sort of thing. So I'll give you, this is really just a visual, just to sort of give you a sense of what these kinds of things look like when you output sequence analysis. So this are just the sequence distribution plots. If you look up the y-axis, what you see essentially are 42,000 tiny, tiny lines, where every line represents what a worker is doing between 0.1 and 0.192, which is 17 years by month later. And then what the cluster analysis, and I do not expect you to read this, nor did I imagine that it would be quite so small, but what the cluster analysis does, to sort of give you a sense, is it starts with all the clusters, and sort of divides them up into 2 clusters, takes those clusters and continues to divide them up until you end up with these silhouettes that seem like reasonable groupings. What we end up with are 10 clusters. I've taken, for the sake of kind of understanding, I've taken those 10 clusters and grouped them into 4 typologies. So I'm going to talk both about clusters and then about typologies. Let me show you what those are. So by and large, Alcoans go to work mostly regularly, and then we either, they're either truncated because we no longer see them in the data when we stop in 2013, or they've terminated. That represents about 69% of total workers and is 2 of our clusters. And I called this typology continuous work. The second set are what I've called minor STDs. So these are 3 different clusters where workers essentially have 1 STD, maybe 2, go back to work, tend to then work sort of regularly until they either terminate or until they're truncated from the data. This I found to be quite fascinating when these clusters came to be. So this represents, not an enormous share, but about 11% of our sample. And these are 3 clusters where there are multiple STD events, sometimes LTD events that are thrown in there. They go back to work even after an LTD event, have an STD event after that, and go back to work after that, and just patterns that, at least in my mind, feel very, very disruptive. And then the final 2 clusters I've grouped as LTD. These are workers that essentially have 1 LTD, sometimes come back to work, and then eventually leave Alcoa. Just to sort of give a sense of what these look like. So these, again, are what the clusters look like. So this is a subsample of all of the workers that had an LTD event. So the LTD event is in yellow, and blue is work. So you'll see that everybody starts work, and then they go mostly to short-term disability, which is in pink, and then they go to LTD after that. So orange is terminate, and what you'll see is that usually very soon after a yellow square, you see an orange square. So it's very rare that people do come back to work, though it does happen. And then on the x-axis here are number of transitions. So part of the reason why I wanted to show this is just to sort of give a sense of the scale in terms of the number of transitions that people are undertaking under their time at Alcoa. So the mean is about 4, or the median, excuse me, is about 4, but you have some workers that are having up to 15, 20, 25 different transitions in their working life. Just a quick note on the demographics. So this is relative to the continuous work group. These are not predicted. These are just summary statistics relative to the group. So those in the LTD typology tend to be a little bit older, have longer tenures, have more percentages of hourly workers and more males than the regular work group. STD minor tend to be also slightly older and slightly higher percentages of hourly workers. Their tenures and percentages of male tend to be about the same as those in the regular work. STD disruptive, so these sort of very disruptive patterns I mentioned also tend to be older. They do tend to have higher tenures. They are hourly, and this is the only group in which there are higher shares of women, which I think is sort of an interesting question. Now, again, FMLA is taken out of this, so these are not maternity leaves. These are sort of real STD events in that way. And then in terms of health, the gradient is what one would expect. So with every sort of more disruptive typology, we see that people generally are in worse health, both through their risk score and then also through the chronic disease. This is just a table that sort of describes that. In the interest of time, I'll skip to the final part of this. So the last thing we wanted to do was to ask whether these work typologies are associated with early retirement. So I'll start off by saying right now that this is very early work. We used, in order to capture early retirement, given that we don't have SSA data, the way we coded early retirement is those that left after the age of 55 or that self-reported as retired, but that were only eligible for either no pension, that would have become eligible for pension, but took it before they were eligible for pension or took partial pension. And then again, we have these typologies grouped into 4 groups. And as I've said, these pension coding is pretty poor. So this is very sort of preliminary in the work. So this is just a multinomial logit, where our reference category is the continuous work. And again, the outcome here is probability of early retirement. Now look at the ends. We've got less than 1,000 people to do this with. So again, we're sort of very low on power. I was happy to hear Mike say that he was low on power. If Mike can be low on power, I can be low on power. And you'll see that the only thing that sort of comes close is the disruptive typology. Now the p-value at that is at, I think, 0.08. So again, these are sort of very, very suggestive, if anything. So if you want to believe that there is some signal below the noise here, there's some suggestive evidence that if you are in a disruptive typology and you see that there may be a pension sitting out in front of you, that you might sort of quit out sooner than you could because presumably your work history or things related to them have gotten you there. So again, much to do, I think, on this realm, but I think an interesting kind of first point at this. So just in summary, there are a number of disparate work disability transitions and trajectories. Some seem, at least in my mind, to be very disruptive. We see small differences across socioeconomic characteristics, larger differences as they relate to health. There's some suggestive evidence on these transition rates that there may be some selection in and out of Alcoa, and maybe possibly within certain jobs. And also some suggestive evidence that these disruptive work trajectories may lead to earlier retirement. And then as I sort of mentioned, we think of manufacturing as very specific, but I do sort of want to remind everyone that about 40% of American workers have jobs that require some physical demand. So in that way, the truckers that work in Alcoa are no different from the truckers we see in the freeways. In terms of next steps, we have a number of them. One is to estimate and model duration. So all of the transitions we've done now are totally agnostic to how long people are spending in these time periods, or in between these time periods for that matter. We want to model the dynamics in the change of health and work exposures. So certainly these things are, as one gets less healthy, then these kinds of things can tend to compound. That's certainly true for job exposures as well. And so thinking about more dynamic modeling as it relates to these changes, I think, will be important. Also exploring transitions between jobs. So we have some reason to believe that there are ways in which Alcoans move out of more dangerous jobs and into relatively safer jobs, partially as a result of a disability episode or to get away from certain types of job exposures. So we're currently doing work on that as well. And then finally, of course, linking to the SSA data so that we can have a more refined version of or outcome, which would be retirement. And then finally, I just wanted to thank my colleague, Sepp, who has been working with this Alcoa data for many years and has been very instrumental in getting me on board. And then, of course, to Sloan for funding this work. Thank you.